Hello, everybody. Queerphobia is not just old-fashioned belief or random prejudice. It is deeply entangled with the history of empire, conquest, and racial domination. Across much of the world, laws criminalizing same-sex intimacy and gender diversity were not indigenous traditions, but colonial imports, imposed to reshape society into the image of European Christian heteropatriarchal norms. Today, many of the countries that still criminalize LGBTQ plus people are former colonies living under legal and cultural regimes first written by imperial powers. Before European conquest, many societies across Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific recognized a wide range of sexualities and gender roles. Anthropological and historical work has documented third gender and multigender roles, such as Two-Spirit people in the indigenous North American nations, Hiras in South Asia, Mahu in Hawaii, Fafine in Samoa. Same-sex relationships and practices that were integrated into social and spiritual life rather than treated as criminal or pathological, and non-binary understandings of gender tied to spirituality, kinship, and cosmology rather than rigid male-female binaries. These systems were not identical or uniformly accepting, but they were theirs, rooted in logical culture, not in European Christian moral codes. Colonialism did not simply discover homophobia. It standardized and weaponized it as part of the broader project of control. Settler colonism and overseas empire were not only about land and resources, they were also about reordering societies according to European norms of race, gender, and sexuality. Legal scholars argue that American and other settler colonial projects structurally promoted a normative white heteropatriarchal sexuality, making sexuality itself a tool of domination. Heterosexual patriarchal family structures were promoted as the foundation of civilized society. Non-heteronormative identities and practices were framed as deviant, sinful, or primitive. Sexual regulation became a way to mark colonized peoples as inferior and justify their governance. In this sense, colonialism was not just a race project, it was a race, gender, sexuality project, where controlling desire and family life was central to controlling colonized populations. One of the clearest connections between colonialism and queerphobia is legal. Many of today's anti-LGBTQ plus laws are directed descendants of colonial penal codes. British colonialism is especially notorious for exporting homophobic legislation. Today, a large share of countries that still criminalize homosexuality are former British colonies, governed by laws that trace back to Victorian-era moral codes. Section 377 and similar provisions criminalized carnal intercourse against the order of nature, targeting same-sex intimacy and other non-procreative sex. These laws were imposed across South Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, often replacing or overriding local practices that did not criminalize same-sex relations in the same way. Even after independence, many states retained these codes, making colonial law appear as traditional or national when it was originally foreign. Research shows a strong statistical connection between British colonial rule and contemporary criminalization of homosexuality, demonstrating that homophobic legal regimes are often colonial legacies, not indigenous inventions. Other European empires, such as Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Dutch, also imposed Christian moral frameworks and criminalized certain sexual behaviors, though the specific legal forms varied. Across Latin America, for example, persecution of same-sex relations intensified with colonization as Catholic doctrine and imperial law combined to police sexuality. Colonial powers justified their expansion through a civilizing mission, claiming they were bringing morality, religion, and order to backward peoples. Sexuality was central to this narrative. Christian missionaries condemned local sexual and gender practices as sinful, unnatural, or even demonic. Colonial administrators framed indigenous sexual diversity as evidence of savagery, using it to rationalize domination. Moral regulation, controlling marriage, family, and sexual behavior became a key tool of governance. In many places, this meant that indigenous gender diverse people and same-sex relationships were not only stigmatized but actively persecuted, sometimes violently, under the banner of religious and moral reform. Colonial queerphobia did not just criminalize, it erased. Records of pre-colonial sexual and gender diversity were suppressed, destroyed, or rewritten. Anthropologists and historians have shown that persecution for sexual motives in Latin America, for example, coincide with the onset of colonization, not with pre-colonial norms. Colonial narratives portrayed colonized societies as either hypersexual and immoral or sexually degenerate, justifying intervention and control. Over time, colonized elites sometimes internalized these narratives, adopting homophobic attitudes as markers of modernity or respectability. This erasure makes it easy for contemporary politicians or religious leaders to claim that queerphobia is traditional or authentic, when in fact it often reflects colonial moral codes more than ancestral ones. The impact of colonial queerphobia is not just historical, it shapes lives now. Many countries still enforce colonial-era anti-LGBTQ plus laws, exposing queer and trans people to arrest, extortation, and violence. Even where laws are not actively enforced, their existence legitimizes social stigma and discrimination. Internal International human rights organizations have documented how colonial legacies continue to structure violence and discrimination against LGBTQ plus and other ancestral, sexual, and gender diverse people worldwide. In some regions, political leaders invoke these laws to claim that homosexuality is a Western import, even though the laws themselves are Western imports. The inversion is one of the most striking ironies of colonial queerphobia. In settler colonial contexts like the United States, Canada, Australia, and others, the story is more complex. Legal advances such as marriage equality, anti-discrimination protections, and employment rights have improved conditions for many LGBTQ plus people, but scholars argue that these gains can also function with a settler colonial framework. Some legal victories are framed in ways that normalize queer people by aligning them with white, middle-class, heteronormative family ideals, marriage, monogamy, property, etc. This can marginalize queer and trans people who do not or cannot fit those norms, especially those who are indigenous, Black, migrant, poor, or otherwise outside the so-called respectable image. One analysis describes this as colonizing queerness, folding certain queer identities into a settler project while leaving its racial and colonial structures intact. In this view, queerphobia is not simply disappearing, it is just being reorganized, with some forms of queerness accepted on terms set by a still colonial state, while others remain criminalized, policed, or erased. Against this backdrop, Indigenous, Black, and Global South activists, scholars, and communities are working to decolonize sexuality and gender. Movements are reclaiming ancestral sexual and gender identities, challenging the idea that queerness is foreign or Western. Legal and political campaigns seek to repel colonial era laws, often explicitly naming their imperial origins. Intersectional and decolonial queer movements insist that liberation must address race, colonialism, and capitalism, not just formal legal equality. International organizations have highlighted how colonial legacies continue to shape the lives of LGBTQ and other ancestral, sexual, and gender diverse people, calling for states to dismantle those structures and recognize Indigenous knowledge and autonomy. The connection between colonization and queerphobia is not metaphorical. It is structural, legal, and historical. Empires exported homophobic laws and moral codes. They criminalized and erased local sexual and gender diversity and used sexuality as a tool of racial and cultural domination. Today's queerphobia, especially where it is backed by law, is often a direct inheritance of empire, even when it is defended as traditional. At the same time, some contemporary LGBTQ plus rights frameworks risk reproducing colonial hierarchies by centering white, Western, and normatively gendered models of acceptable queerness. To fully understand and dismantle queerphobia, we have to see it not just as personal prejudice or religious belief, but as part of a long project of colonial control over bodies, desires, and futures. Decolonizing sexuality means not only repealing old laws, but also recovering suppressed histories, honoring ancestral gender and sexual diversity, and building movements that refuse to separate queer liberation from struggles against racism, colonialism, and dispossession. So, all these laws that's going into effect has been in effect targeting gender, sexuality, identity basically of any form, because here lately everybody's identities have been targeted, be it a religious identity, sexuality, gender identity, middle class identity, like whatever. Everybody's identities have pretty much been targeted here lately. So, what can we do to normalize once again what was normal before people come across, landed on a boat, and decided that this is how life should be for everyone around them? What are some steps that we can take? What are some law pushbacks that we can put into protest? I mean, I have a few things that's going to follow this in videos, but I'd like to hear what y'all think about how they changed what was basically because of colonialization.